What if I told you that the entire English monarchy, every king and queen who ever sat on the throne after the year 1400, might have gotten there because of a lie? Not a political lie, not a forged document, but a biological one, hidden in the blood, passed down through centuries, and completely invisible, until a team of scientists cracked open a 500-year-old skeleton and pulled out its DNA. In 2012, archaeologists made a discovery so improbable it sounded like fiction. They found the body of King Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, buried beneath a parking lot in the city of Leicester. That alone would have been one of the greatest archaeological finds of the century. But what came next was something nobody was prepared for. When scientists analyzed Richard's DNA, they found something so disturbing that the research team quietly revised parts of their own report. The full findings were carefully worded. Certain implications were buried in footnotes. And for over a decade, the most explosive detail of the entire discovery was treated as a minor statistical curiosity. Now, in 2025, the truth has finally come out, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the English crown. Stay with me, because this story has betrayal, royal infidelity, medieval warfare, and a DNA bombshell that shakes the foundations of one of the oldest monarchies on Earth. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to a woman named Philippa Langley. In the early 2000s, Langley was a screenwriter and amateur historian living in Edinburgh, Scotland. She'd been diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis, a chronic fatigue condition, and had left her career in marketing behind. But she had a passion that refused to die, the real story of Richard III. Most people know Richard from Shakespeare's play, the hunchbacked villain who murders his way to the throne, kills his own nephews, and dies screaming for a horse on the battlefield. But Langley, like many members of the Richard III Society, believed that portrait was a lie, a piece of Tudor propaganda. She wanted to find the real Richard, and she believed that finding his body was the first step. Here's where it gets almost unbelievable. In 2004, Langley visited Leicester and walked into a social services parking lot in the center of the city. She later described feeling a strange, overwhelming sensation, a gut instinct that Richard's body was somewhere beneath that asphalt. When she looked down at the ground, someone had painted the letter R on a parking space. It stood for reserved, but to Langley, it meant something else entirely. For the next 8 years, she fought to make the excavation happen. She approached Leicester City Council, the University of Leicester, and the Richard III Society. Sponsors pulled out. Academics were skeptical. The lead archaeologist, Richard Buckley, told her the odds of finding the church beneath the parking lot were about 50-50, and the odds of finding the actual grave were 9-1 against. But Langley wouldn't stop. She launched a crowdfunding campaign that raised over £17,000 from Richard III Society members around the world. And on August 25, 2012, exactly 527 years after Richard's burial, the excavation began. What happened next stunned everyone. On the very first day of the dig, just hours into a planned 2-week excavation, archaeologist Matthew Morris uncovered a pair of human leg bones in the first trench. The bones were found at the northern end of the parking lot, exactly where Langley had predicted the choir of the medieval Greyfriars Church would be. As the excavation continued, more of the skeleton was revealed, and with each new detail, the excitement grew. The skeleton belonged to a male, aged somewhere between 30 and 34. Richard died at 32. The bones showed severe scoliosis, a dramatic S-shaped curvature of the spine. Historical accounts had long described Richard as having one shoulder higher than the other. This wasn't the grotesque hunchback of Shakespeare, but it was a real, significant spinal condition. And then there were the wounds. 11 injuries were found on the skeleton, and 9 of them were to the skull. These weren't random marks. They told the story of a man who died in violent, close-quarters combat. 3 shallow shaving wounds on the top of the skull suggested glancing blows from a serrated blade. A dagger had been stabbed into the right cheek. A keyhole-shaped wound on the crown of the head had been punched through by a rondel dagger, a needle-like weapon popular in the late medieval period. But the killing blows came from behind. One massive strike, likely from a halberd or a heavy sword, sliced away a large section of the base of the skull, exposing the brain. A second thrust penetrated over 10 centimeters into the brain itself. Either wound would have been fatal almost immediately. The forensic evidence suggested Richard had lost or been forced to remove his helmet. He was likely kneeling or bent forward when the final blows were struck. There was one more wound, a blade thrust upward through the pelvis that would have caused catastrophic internal damage. But the angle of this injury, combined with the fact that the area would have been protected by armor during battle, pointed to a grim conclusion. This was a humiliation wound, delivered after death, while the king's naked body was draped over a horse and paraded back to Leicester. Contemporary accounts tell us that at the Battle of Bosworth on August 22, 1485, Richard made a desperate, almost suicidal cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. It was the medieval equivalent of going all in. His horse became mired in the marshy ground. He was forced to dismount, and then, surrounded, outnumbered, and stripped of his helmet, he fought on foot until they cut him down. The forensic evidence on the skeleton matches those accounts almost perfectly. No defensive wounds on his hands or arms, meaning he was still wearing his body armor when the killing blows landed. But his head was completely exposed. He was attacked from multiple angles by at least 3, possibly 4, assailants wielding different weapons. It wasn't a duel. It was an execution on the battlefield. And after he fell, they stripped him naked, threw his body over a horse, and paraded him through the streets of Leicester. The wound to the pelvis, the final insult, was likely delivered by a victorious soldier who couldn't resist one last act of contempt against a dead king. 527 years later, that skeleton told the story more honestly than any chronicle ever had. But confirming this was actually Richard. That required something else entirely. The identification rested on DNA, specifically 2 kinds, mitochondrial DNA and Y-chromosome DNA. But before we get to the bombshell, it's worth noting what else the science revealed, because it fundamentally changed how we see this king. Isotopic analysis of Richard's bones showed a dramatic shift in diet during his lifetime. As a child, he ate modestly, but once he rose to power, his diet became rich in meat, fish, and imported luxuries. And the data suggested he was drinking the equivalent of a bottle of wine a day. DNA markers predicted blue eyes and light blonde hair, at least in childhood. This directly contradicted the dark, brooding figure Shakespeare made famous. The earliest surviving portrait of Richard, held by the Society of Antiquaries in London, actually shows a fairer-complexioned man, and now science confirmed it was the most accurate depiction. A facial reconstruction based on CT scans of the skull revealed a face that was surprisingly ordinary, a narrow jaw, high cheekbones, and an expression that looked more thoughtful than menacing. This was not a monster. This was a medieval nobleman who happened to become king in one of the most violent periods in English history. But the real revelation, the one that would shake the foundations of English history, came from the genetic lineage testing. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, mother to child, generation after generation. To test it, scientists needed living people who could trace their ancestry back to Richard through an unbroken chain of mothers. Genealogist John Ashdown Hill had spent years tracking down exactly these individuals. He identified 2 people, Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker living in London, and Wendy Doldig, both of them direct matrilineal descendants of Richard's sister, Anne of York, separated by 17 and 19 generations, respectively. Professor Turi King at the University of Leicester led the DNA analysis. The ancient DNA was extracted under extraordinarily careful conditions. The excavated tooth was cleaned, treated with UV light, then crushed and processed in a dedicated ancient DNA facility at the University of York. The mitochondrial DNA was amplified, sequenced, and compared. The result was stunning. The skeleton's mitochondrial DNA was a perfect match with Michael Ibsen and differed from Wendy Daldig by only a single base, exactly what you'd expect across that many generations. The probability that this was Richard III exceeded 99.999%. But here's where the story takes its dark turn. Scientists also tested the Y-chromosome, which passes from father to son, tracing the paternal line. If the Y-chromosome from the skeleton matched living male line descendants of Richard's ancestor, Edward III, it would confirm the Plantagenet royal bloodline was unbroken. It didn't match. 5 living men were identified as male line descendants of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort, who traced his lineage back to Edward III through an unbroken chain of fathers. 4 of those 5 men shared a Y-chromosome type consistent with each other, confirming they were indeed related as expected. But the 5th had a completely different Y-chromosome profile, meaning a false paternity event had occurred somewhere in his recent family history. More importantly, the skeleton's Y-chromosome didn't match any of the 5 men. Not a single one. This meant that somewhere in the 19 generations between Richard III and the living Somerset descendants, at least one child was fathered by someone other than the supposed father in the official genealogical record. Now, when the results were published in Nature Communications in 2014, the Y-chromosome mismatch was acknowledged, but it was presented carefully. The researchers noted that false paternity events are not uncommon. Estimates range from 1 to 2% per generation. Over 19 generations, the probability of at least one such event is statistically significant. The mismatch was framed as interesting but not necessarily scandalous, and that framing made sense at the time. But here's what many people didn't fully appreciate. The break in the male line could have occurred on either side of the family tree. It might have happened in the Beaufort line, the descendants of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, where complex legitimization and contested succession made false paternity more plausible across a long chain of generations. Or it might have happened in Richard's direct line. If the break occurred between Edward III and Richard III himself, meaning in the line running from Edward III to Edmund of Langley to Richard of Conisburg to Richard, Duke of York, and finally to Richard III, then the implications are staggering. It would mean that Richard's father was not the biological son of his supposed father. It would mean the entire House of York's claim to the English throne was built on a foundational lie. The Wars of the Roses, the bloodiest civil conflict in English history, were fought over bloodline legitimacy, and if the Yorkist blood wasn't what it claimed to be, then everything that followed, every battle, every betrayal, every execution, was fought over a phantom. The 2014 research team handled this carefully. They couldn't determine where the break occurred. They noted both possibilities and moved on. The media covered the parking lot discovery, the scoliosis, the battle wounds. The Y-chromosome anomaly was treated as a footnote, but it was never really a footnote. It was a ticking time bomb. By 2025, advances in ancient DNA technology had made it possible to revisit the question with far greater precision. New genetic studies, building on the original Leicester data and incorporating additional samples, zeroed in on the breakpoint with a level of certainty that wasn't possible a decade earlier. The new analysis utilized cutting-edge genetic technology to compare Richard's DNA not only with the Somerset descendants, but with broader data sets and additional historical samples. By cross-referencing multiple genetic markers and applying updated statistical models, researchers established with extraordinary confidence where the lineage fractured. The findings sent shockwaves through the historical community. The Y-chromosome evidence pointed strongly toward the break having occurred in Richard's direct ancestral line, not in the distant Beaufort branch. This meant that one of the central figures in the Yorkist claim to the throne was likely not the biological child of his recorded father. The implications reverberate far beyond medieval genealogy. If the Duke of York was not a biological Plantagenet through the male line, then the entire Yorkist dynasty's claim to rule England was illegitimate by the very standards of bloodline succession that medieval society held sacred. Edward IV, who seized the throne from the Lancastrian Henry VI, may have had no biological right to do so. And Richard III, who usurped the throne from his own nephew, did he know? Was he trying to protect a secret? Or was he just as much a victim of a deception that stretched back generations? This brings us to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries: the princes in the Tower. After Edward IV died in 1483, his two young sons, 12-year-old Edward V and 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, were placed in the Tower of London. They were never seen again. For 5 centuries, Richard III has been the prime suspect in their disappearance and presumed murder. But the DNA revelations add a haunting new dimension to the mystery. If the Yorkist bloodline was compromised, if Richard knew, or even suspected, that his family's claim was built on illegitimate foundations, then the disappearance of the princes takes on an entirely different character. Were they eliminated not because they were legitimate heirs, but because their existence might have exposed the truth? Meanwhile, historian John Ashdown Hill, whose mitochondrial DNA research was crucial to identifying Richard's skeleton, made another breakthrough before his death in 2018. Working with genealogist Glenn Moran, he traced the mitochondrial DNA of the princes in the Tower through their aunt, Margaret Woodville, to a living descendant, opera singer Elizabeth Roberts. This means that for the first time in history, science has the tools to test whether bones held in an urn at Westminster Abbey, believed since 1674 to be the remains of the two princes, actually belong to them. Philippa Langley has been leading the charge to have those bones examined. The science is ready. The DNA profiles exist for both the maternal line of the princes and, now, for the Yorkist paternal line. All that's needed is permission to open the urn. If that happens, it could close the oldest cold case in English history, and potentially confirm whether the Yorkist bloodline deception extended to the princes themselves. Let's step back and take in the full picture. A woman with chronic fatigue syndrome stood in a parking lot and felt something. She spent 8 years fighting to dig up that parking lot. On the first day of the excavation, they found a skeleton. That skeleton turned out to be a king who'd been missing for 527 years. His DNA confirmed his identity beyond any reasonable doubt, but it also revealed a secret that medieval England would have gone to war over, and in fact may have done exactly that. The Y-chromosome mismatch doesn't just challenge the legitimacy of Richard III. It challenges the legitimacy of every English monarch whose claim traces back through the Yorkist line. It suggests that the Wars of the Roses, which killed tens of thousands of people and reshaped the English nation, may have been fought in part over a bloodline that was fiction. And here's the deepest irony. The Tudor dynasty that defeated Richard at Bosworth and took the throne had their own questionable claims to legitimacy. Henry VII's claim came through the Beaufort line, which had been explicitly barred from the succession. He cemented his position by marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. But if the Yorkist line itself was compromised, then that marriage brought no additional legitimacy at all. Royal legitimacy, it turns out, has always been less about biology and more about power, perception, and the ability to control the narrative. The DNA doesn't invalidate the historical reigns of these monarchs. They ruled, they governed, they shaped history regardless of what chromosomes they carried. but it does reveal how fragile the foundations of dynastic power truly were. One act of infidelity. One child whose father was not who the records claimed. That's all it took to build, or destroy, an empire. Richard III was buried without ceremony in a hastily dug grave in the choir of Greyfriars Church. His body was stripped, humiliated, and forgotten for over 5 centuries. In 2015, he was finally reinterred at Leicester Cathedral in a coffin of English oak, built by his own distant relative Michael Ibsen, the same man whose DNA helped prove his identity. Benedict Cumberbatch, himself a distant cousin of the king, read a poem by the poet laureate at the ceremony. But the real legacy of the discovery isn't the ceremony or the cathedral or even the parking lot. It's the DNA, a few fragments of ancient genetic code that survived 500 years in the ground and told a truth that no chronicle, no historian, and no Shakespeare play ever could. The blood of kings was never what they claimed it was. And now, finally, we know. If you found this story fascinating, like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden truths of history. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Westminster Abbey bones should be tested? Let's talk about it.